Good morning. Today I would like to start teaching on the Ephramite Two-House teaching, which will take several teachings, so this is part one. And in order to really understand what the Ephramite Two-House teaching is all about, we have to start at the very beginning. So I would like to start by reading the beginning of the history of it from the book of 1 Kings chapter 12. And it says this: Rehoboam went to Shechem, where all Israel came to proclaim him king. When Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from Solomon, Jeroboam was living in Egypt, but they sent and summoned him. Jeroboam and the whole community of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father laid a harsh yoke on us, but if you will lighten the harsh service we had to render your father and ease his heavy yoke that he put on us, we will serve you." He said to them, "Leave me alone for 3 days, then come back to me." So the people left. King Rehoboam consulted the older men who had been in attendance on Solomon his father, during his lifetime, and asked, "What advice would you give me as to how to answer these people?" They said to him, "If you will start today being a servant to these people, if you will serve them, be responsive to them, and give them favorable consideration, then they will be your servants forever." But he didn't take their advice the older men gave, but instead he consulted the young men he had grown up with, who were now his attendants. He asked them, "What advice would you give me, so that we can give an answer to these people who said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father laid on us'?" The young men had grown up with him and said, "These people who said to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter for us,' here's the answer that you should give them. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Yes, my father burdened you with the heavy yoke, but I will make it heavier. My father controlled you with whips, but I will control you with scorpions." So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king had requested, by saying, "Come to me again the 3rd day." And the king answered the people harshly. Abandoning the advice of the older men had given him, he addressed them according to the advice of the younger men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father controlled you with whips, but I will control you with scorpions." So the king didn't listen to the people, and that was something Adonai brought about, so that he could fulfill his word, which Adonai had spoken through Achiah from Shiloh to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king wasn't listening to them, the people answered the king, "Do we have any share in David? We have no heritage in the son of Yeshai. Go to your tents, Israel. Care for your own house, David." So Israel left for their tents. This was where the nation of Israel split into two houses, into the house of Israel in the north and the house of Judah in the south. It was all because of taxation in the very beginning. The northern part of Israel was very prosperous and commercial. The south was the religious center. So you had two different systems that were really in force at the same time. You had capitalism in the north, and you had theocracy in the south. It wasn't that the northern house of Israel was refusing to go along with the religious rules and regulations of the day. They were just tired of being taxed. Solomon had taxed them and taxed them and taxed them with all of his building projects. And they were tired of being overtaxed, and they just wanted not to do away with the tax, but just to let up on them a little bit so that they could keep some of the prosperity that they were providing at the time. But Rehoboam, unfortunately, Solomon's successor, refused to listen to those advisors who had served under Solomon and saw that this wasn't a very good idea to keep taxing the people at such a heavy rate. Instead, he went to his advisors who he had grown up with, men of his own age, young men, who had not seen what had taken place under Solomon, and said, you know, if you let these people begin to rebel now, they'll never stop. So you better squash it while you can. So he threatened them even more heavily. This caused the nation to split into two: the house of Israel in the north, the house of Judah in the south. And this is how the whole situation really began. It's very interesting to see that it wasn't over religious things, it was over commerce. And we see that taking place in the U.S. today. When you have an ideology that is working contradictory to the commercial aspects of that run the nation, then you have a real problem. And definitely Jeroboam and Rehoboam here had a very definite problem. So the nations had to split. And once they did, of course, Judah sought help from Egypt and threatened to, and did, invade the north. The northern house of Israel then went to Assyria for help and almost ended up conquering Judah. But it became a standoff for a while, until finally Assyria, who had had their eye on Israel for a long time, decided to invade the house of Israel, their ally, eventually conquer it, and take off many of their learned and more prosperous people into Assyria, and brought in the Kuthians to mix with the people that were left in the land to keep commerce going so that taxes could be paid to Assyria. And this is how the whole thing started. And in part 2 we will take up with some of the aspects that took place right after that, and we'll go down through history and show how the two-house Ephramite principle is understood and put into practice. So we'll see you in part 2.